Hello and welcome back to Per la Victoire, where we talk about historical, vintage, and modern sewing. Today I'd like to share with you 5 tips on buying fabric, especially if you're a beginner. The prospect of starting a new hobby and a complex hobby like sewing can be overwhelming, especially when you see the varieties of fabrics available. New names, new textures, new definitions, and sometimes pattern envelopes don't really guide you with the right information on picking the right fabric. Looking back on the start of my sewing journey, the biggest mistakes I encountered or the biggest hurdles I encountered were because of poorly matching my fabric choice to my selected pattern. And I want to pass on some tips to you all to hopefully help your sewing journey as well. So the first thing is understanding the difference between fiber and weave, and from there understanding the different kinds of fabrics, so when you read a pattern envelope to see the suggested fabric types, you have a better understanding of what kind of fabrics will work best with that design. I highly recommend for beginner sewers to pick up something like the Reader's Digest Complete Guide to Sewing. I got this on eBay a few years ago for not a lot of money, maybe like $15 or $20. It's pretty much a textbook. Look how thick that book is. This particular copy is dated to 1978, but when I got it, it was in pretty good condition, and it's filled with so much sewing information. This tells you all the details on almost any technique you'll find when sewing, and crucially, it's got a great detailed section on fiber versus weave. So what do we mean with fiber? Fiber is the actual material that a fabric is made out of. So some of the main fibers you might encounter are cotton, linen, wool, silk, viscose, rayon. These are the yarns that actually make up the fabric. Cotton coming from cotton buds, the cotton plant, linen coming from the flax plant, wool coming from sheep's wool, viscose and rayon being like a semi-man-made, semi-natural fiber derived from wood pulp. And then from these yarns, from these fibers, we get the weaves. These fibers can become any kind of weave. So twill weave, a satin weave, a herringbone weave. This is also where you're getting damask and jacquard type fabrics. That's how the fibers are woven together to create those raised surface patterns. And this is what I find most confusing on the back of pattern envelopes. They'll say things like silk and silk types. Those statements are kind of at odds with each other because silk is a fiber and then silk types means what? What is a silk type? Is it something that feels silky in that it is drapey and soft and shiny and thin? Or is it just any fabric made with a silk fiber, which can lead you to a rough, thick, heavy, and stiff fabric if it's that kind of weave? Learning about all of the different types of fibers and weaves and names of finished fabrics and then what those fabrics even look like and how they behave and how to work with them is a bit of a process on its own. The method I found that worked best for me is I just went through as many fabric websites as possible, just using the different search terms or filters to see what did a cotton lawn look like? How does the lawn compare to a broadcloth? Oh, the lawn is a little bit lighter and flowier, especially if you're on websites that have pictures of the fabric draped over a table or swirled around or manipulated in some way. You can get a pretty good visual comparison of what different types of fabrics will look like. Of course, there are also books like the Reader's Digest book and dozens of other fabric textbooks and blogs and articles and what have you. But I personally find that looking at fabric websites that list the individual properties of each fabric, the weight, the drape, the examples of it swirled up or draped on a table, are just so much more dynamic and helpful than reading a list of definitions in a book, but that's just how I learn. And that brings us to our next tip, which is the pattern envelope. In a way, the pattern envelope gives you the most information and also the least information. It requires a little bit of interpretation to understand what fabric will best pair with that pattern design. I want to start with what's most helpful, in my opinion, on the pattern envelope, and to me that's actually the pattern cover, the illustrations, or the sample garment. Even if I don't know the name of the fabric yet, I can see that it's drapey, it's flowy, it's not see-through, it's not thick, it's not stiff. It looks kind of soft and lightweight. It has to be fine enough for all the gathering and ruffles, so maybe in a fabric store I can crunch up bits of fabric in my hand to see what makes these kinds of ruffles and soft gathers. It also kind of skims the body, it comes close to the body, it doesn't stand away from the body, so that's something to look for in fabric photos or samples. Does it hang close or does it stand far away, kind of stiffly? So then let's look at the back of this pattern envelope of McCall's 7894 and see what it recommends. It says suggested fabrics: crepe, georgette, crepe de chine, chiffon. Okay, that's actually pretty helpful. Can I tell which of those fabrics made this sample dress? No. Maybe the crepe? Because it looks kind of opaque at the bottom here where you can see the back side of that ruffle. I don't think it's a chiffon. I don't think it's a georgette. Those are kind of sheer too. And it doesn't seem to have a lining all the way down because I can see the bottom of the skirt. In a way, this particular envelope is one of the better ones. It gives very clear search terms or something to look for. But what I find is really missing in pattern envelopes is it doesn't give the qualities of the fabric. I think this would be better off saying something like suggested fabrics: lightweight, drapey, flowy, semi-opaque or sheer fabrics such as crepe, georgette, chiffon. Instead, we just get some examples and then we're left to piece together what are the shared characteristics of these suggested fabrics. They're all lightweight, drapey, flowy, semi-opaque, or kind of sheer. Let's take a look at an example that's a little bit more confusing. So here we've got New Look 6594, which is for like a vintagey style drapey dress. Again, first place to look, front of the pattern envelope, the samples and the drawings. It looks kind of drapey, but not so drapey as the other example. You can see that the A-line skirt kind of sticks out from her body. Okay, so maybe not for a chiffon or something super lightweight and sheer. But there's a little bit of drape, there's some gathers, and probably if you're doing this little flutter sleeve, you want a fabric that's kind of on the drapier end. And this pattern suggests challis, charmeuse, crepe, crepe de chine, jacquards, linen types, silky types. This is where I get confused, this is where I stop. Okay, challis, drapey, usually in a viscose fiber. Okay, I get it. Charmeuse, usually made of silk or polyester, maybe even a kind of blend of those two fibers. I feel like that's really drapey and not quite like with the example, but I see it. I think that would look cute. Crepe, crepe de chine, yes, love it. Jacquards. Could you imagine this dress being made in a jacquard? A jacquard is usually quite stiff because of how the fibers are woven together to make that raised textured design on the fabric. I feel like a jacquard wouldn't work for this unless we're very specific about some specific type of jacquard that's super lightweight and loosely woven. I haven't seen a kind of jacquard like that yet, but the world is large and vast. And then this is what I see on a lot of patterns: linen types and silky types. What does that mean? What is a linen type? A linen, just like other fibers, can be woven to a fabric that is super stiff or super smooth or super drapey and lightweight. You can have linen gauze and you can have linen suiting. So which is it? I don't think it's a dress appropriate for a linen suiting, but it's not really telling you that. Or does it assume that the viewer of the pattern envelope understands linen types to be the drapier, finer linens, like a linen gauze or a linen lawn or something? I don't know. I can only conjecture. This is where I see this and I want to stop. I want to assess. I want to check some fabric samples and see what this really means. And then silky types. I can guess that because I mentioned charmeuse and crepe earlier, those are fabrics that can be made of silk, that it wants something kind of smooth and flowy, fine and lightweight. Okay, but then why say silky types? Just say smooth, fine, lightweight, flowy fabrics and lead with the fabric qualities. Anytime you see this like linen types, silky types, cotton blends of what? How is that cotton supposed to drape? How is it supposed to behave? How opaque should it be? How stiff should it be? Again, look at the pattern envelope, the examples, see if you can find other people who've made that garment and see what they use. Take notes of the qualities of different fabrics so that you can also make an informed choice on what final qualities your fabric should have, regardless of its name, especially if you're thrifting a fabric or using something secondhand. You can pick fabric that has the right qualities, even though it might not have a name at all. Once you're familiar with fabric types and how they behave and what they're commonly called, you can make a more informed decision based on the information provided on the front and back of the pattern envelope to choose the best fabric for your project. My third tip is to pick solid fabrics over printed ones, regardless of fabric weave or type. It's a lot easier to sew with a solid colored fabric than something with a stripe or a print, because sometimes those prints have a direction to them. For instance, all the flowers might be pointing upwards with their stems pointing downwards, or there might be a stripe where if you accidentally rotate a piece or don't match something up correctly, that stripe now looks strange where it's joined at a seam. This is what we usually call a directional fabric, in that the fabric has some kind of obvious and sometimes less obvious direction to it, so you want all your pieces of fabric facing the same direction when you cut them out. And pattern envelopes will usually acknowledge this by saying something like, get additional fabric if you're working with a directional fabric. For a beginner in particular, I feel like working with solid fabrics is much easier than working with a print fabric, and then also considering the orientation of the pieces. So in addition to getting those pieces situated on the correct graining line, now you're making sure the tops and bottoms of the pieces are situated correctly. You might not be as familiar with how a pattern piece looks before it's made up into a garment yet, and you might end up with a flower pointing upside down at the front of your garment, or something similar. I know I have, and I had a much easier time whenever I was working with a solid fabric versus a fabric that had an obvious direction to it when I was first starting out. And even now, sometimes when I do get a printed fabric, I spend a long time deliberating, does it even have a direction? Are the flowers meant to go in a particular direction, or are these diamonds meant to be seen from a particular angle? And it's tough to make sure everything is going in the best way possible. My fourth tip is that if you do want to work with a printed fabric, I would suggest working with a small, busy print over a large, very obvious print. Why is this? It's a lot easier to disguise mistakes or slight inconsistencies with how things line up with a small, busy print versus with a large print. Think about a print that may have very prominent large motifs or flowers or diagonals or something on it. It can be very difficult to match those up or place them in a way that's not awkward. Think about having a particular motif on one side of your chest. It might draw a lot of attention to that area. Additionally, if you do really want to work with a plaid or striped fabric, try choosing a plaid fabric that is regular or has an even repeat. Those are terms you might see. So that means that the plaid, any way you turn it, all the lines of that plaid design will match up. There are some plaids where if you do try to pattern match, you'll see that they're not regular repeats of the plaid, or the repeat is quite large or far apart, which makes matching seems much more difficult, because then all of a sudden you have a stray green line or a stray yellow bar somewhere, and that's interrupting the regular repeat. So if you can, try to find a plaid that has a regular repeat to make pattern matching a little bit easier, to make the orientation of the pieces a little bit easier. My fifth tip is to pick matte fabrics over shiny fabrics. Shiny fabrics, think charmeuse and satin, tend to be difficult to work with on any day. They may require special equipment, such as needles and thread, or special techniques, such as using tissue paper between the layers of fabric to cut them out correctly, or cutting them out with a rotary cutter or really sharp scissors. They more easily tend to pucker at seams, fray at the cut edges, snag, or show imperfections or misalignments. They tend to just be difficult to work with entirely. If you're up for the challenge, I applaud you. I found that the projects I wanted to just crumple up and throw into the trash bin were the ones where I was working with satin polyester fabric. It just couldn't press. It snagged even when my nails were perfectly filed and cut. It just frayed when I looked at it, and I was running out of seam allowances, and suddenly my blouse turned out like 2 sizes smaller than it started with. It was not worth the effort. I should have just chosen the right fabric. I should have done like a matte, not slippery, not shiny fabric. In general, I find matte fabrics so much easier to work with. One example of this is sateen. So this is a cotton fiber in a satin weave, and it's called sateen. That's its special name. I used cotton sateen fabric to make a corset and to make a Renaissance gown. Obviously not historically accurate by any means in both of those scenarios, but it definitely gave the final look that I was going for. And in both instances, the fabric was really easy to work with. It didn't fray as much as a polyester or silk satin would have frayed. It was pretty easy to handle, pretty easy to cut, and it had a little bit of heft to it because of the cotton fibers in it, which were just a little bit heavier than the silk fibers for that particular kind of fabric. And I just found that these garments draped well, or just held their shape much better than an alternative was, and I found it super easy to sew with them. And these are still things I kept to this day. They didn't end up in the trash bin. I absolutely love them. A final note, different fabrics do require different approaches, techniques, and treatments. That's why they sell sewing machine needles and hand sewing needles in different sizes and thicknesses and lengths. That's why they sell different types of thread. Whenever I start a project, I always sew a little sample out of the scraps or offcuts, a sample on my sewing machine to test the needle size, thread weight, thread tension, and maybe other techniques like buttonholes or interfacing. I just do this all in a little scrap so that I have my machine perfectly calibrated to that one project and have all the pieces I need set up on my machine for that type of fabric. As you get more experience, this process will be a little bit easier, and you can develop an intuition for what approach will be best for what fabric type. And then I want to share a bonus tip that when I learned it, it actually saved me money because I could buy a little bit less yardage, or I would have some yardage left over. When a pattern says to cut a piece out on the fold, you actually don't need to fold the fabric perfectly in half lengthwise, depending on the size of your pattern piece. You can just fold over the amount of fabric that you need lengthwise, place your pattern piece on that, and that's cutting it out on the fold. At first, I was folding my fabric in half lengthwise all the way down, and I would be left with weird offcuts out on the sides that I couldn't use for other pieces of the project or for anything else, and it was just wasted material. But once I started using the technique where I'm just folding over a little bit of fabric at a time for that specific pattern piece cut on the fold, I was able to use my fabric more wisely. And if you've been following my projects for a few years, you've seen I've been able to make dresses out of 1.5 yards of fabric, or a skirt out of 1 yard of fabric, or a dress out of 2 yards of fabric. And this is usually from me folding the fabric very carefully to just fold for what I need to cut that particular piece out on the fold, versus folding the entire length of fabric in half. I really hope this video was helpful. Let me know in the comments below if you have any fabric buying tips or fabric tips for beginner sewists. I'd love to hear them. I'd love to learn more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.